Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
No, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey, folks, welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. I am delighted today to be joined by a guy whose expertise overlaps with our historic moment so perfectly, it's a little ridiculous. Edward Fishman, who is a guy who deeply understands economics and international economics, how they intersect with the world of politics, how they intersect with the world of diplomacy, and what's happening in the world right now with this alignment of power that we're watching sort of recalibrate itself in real time. Folks, the book is called ChokePoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. And I wanted to welcome Edward Fishman to the show today. Edward, thank you so much for coming on. I want to start out by asking you, because I ask this question frequently, your decision to write this book at this moment, when you started this, did you anticipate we would be dealing with a President Harris or a President Trump facing up to these consequential moments in this set of great power conflicts that we're experiencing right now?
Sure. Well, Rick, thanks so much for having me on the show. I've been a fan for a long time, so it's nice to be here with you today. So I started writing this book in 2022. So to be honest, it was before the midterms. I wasn't even really thinking about whether, I was assuming it would be a, Biden versus Trump rematch, and didn't really have a perspective in terms of where things would go. And what I really tried to do with the book, and I hope readers feel this way, is to write it in a way where it has sort of timeless applicability. Like, I think it would have been relevant had Harris won, and I think it's relevant for better or for worse, especially now, given that Trump, the tariff man, is in the White House.
You talk about this era of economic warfare, and in the spectrum of soft power, America excels at hard power, but in the spectrum of soft power, our ability to use different tools to leverage our economic impact in the world has been pretty strong over the last few decades, but it's gotten increasingly refined and sophisticated. Talk to us about why that economic soft power has come to the fore, what those sort of techniques are, and why it's so important to put that in the sort of spectrum of conflict that we find ourselves in today.
Sure. So that's right, Rick. I mean, the thesis of my book is that we're living in an age of economic warfare. Tariffs, sanctions, export controls, they become the primary way that great powers compete with each other. It's true of the United States, but it's also true of the European Union, China, Japan, India. It's sort of it's everywhere. And it's a real far cry from when I was growing up in the 1990s, when we saw economic relations between great powers as win-win. And we were trying to explicitly bring China and Russia into the global economy. I think the big thing, there are really a couple things that changed. I think on the one hand, in the 90s, you had hyperglobalization, right? The integration of financial markets, supply chains, not just within the West, but also with the likes of Russia and China. And what this did, Rick, is it created choke points, these areas of the global economy where one country has a dominant position and there's very little redundancy. And so countries like the US can weaponize them against foreign actors. So hyperglobalization kind of gives is a necessary precondition. Then you need two other factors. The other are politics. In the US, I think in the wake of the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, there's just no more political will in the US to fight wars, not just in the Democratic Party, but also in the Republican Party. And so if you can't fight a war, you got to think, well, what else can we do? And so that's why you've seen presidents on both sides of the aisle turn to these tools when dealing with everything from Iran's nuclear program to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then if I could, just one other factor is geopolitics. We built the global economy assuming that it would be we'd have a benign geopolitical environment, but now we certainly don't, right? We've got great power competition as intense as it's been for decades. And so that's the final factor I'd give you.
We find ourselves suddenly with a guy who, well, let me loop back for a second. It seems to me that the people that develop these current tools thought of them in a sophisticated way, with a calibrated approach, with a degree of rationality about how they would apply them, with a set of objectives in mind that were rationally based. It strikes me that Trump has a sort of 19th century view of tariffs, views them in a maximalist way, does not correctly calibrate what they will do to the economy overall. So are you concerned that we're in a space right now where we have a guy who doesn't think clearly and cogently about these tools, but what does want to engage in this sort of like a hyper maximalist view of tariffs and economic warfare?
Yeah, I am very concerned, Rick. And that's because, I basically look at, where are things headed? What's the direction of travel? I don't think it's realistic to think that the U.S. is just going to stop using sanctions and tariffs. Biden used them, Obama used them. It's not just a Trump thing, right? The thing I'm worried about is I really see two potential futures for the world economy and the global order. The first is one where the use of these tools leads to a bifurcation into blocks, where you have a block of the United States and its allies and other democracies, and then another block, maybe that's built around China and other
maybe it's the BRICS,
countries.
maybe it's right.
Exactly. And I think that's kind of where we were headed during the Biden administration. You heard this term friendshoring, which was, we were going to not onshore everything, but we were just going to integrate more deeply with our allies. And I could actually see that being a good global economy.
I see an argument there.
Yeah. What I'm worried about when I see from the first month of the new Trump administration is that we're seeing Trump deploy these tools, not just against our adversaries, but in some ways, even more intensively against our friends. 25% tariff threats against Canada and Mexico, telling the EU that they're going to get tariffed, threatening sanctions on Colombia. The future that I think that this will take us to, if this is how the rest of the Trump administration goes, is one where we have a chaotic breakdown of the global economy. And you don't just have two blocks. You have the U.S. kind of operating on an island, and our allies hedging and maybe even drifting back into China's orbit. And we sort of wind up in autarky by default, where we try to do everything at home. And the reason that worries me, Rick, first of all, it would be bad for us economically. It's going to lead to inflation. It's going to lead to slower economic growth. The thing that I really worry about is what history shows is when states can't acquire markets and resources through open trade, that's when you get war, the temptation for imperialism and conquest. And so in some ways, Trump's talk about trying to seize Greenland for mineral resources, that really frightens me, because that's comes out of this autarkic thinking that you need resources to be under your juridical control in order to feel like you have access to them.
It's funny because I was contemplating this whole thing with the Munich Security Conference yesterday, and I remember, and I can't remember which historian it was, but I was reading a book one time about the internal German decision making to take the Sudetenland, and Hitler wasn't just like maniacally expansive. He had an argument that Germany, on the autarky side, could never sufficiently provide its own food and resources to grow its economy to be a peer competitor with the rest of Europe or the world. And so taking Czechoslovakia, there was a more rational resource and trade and economic, it was wrong to do, but there was an argument internally for a long time that was an economically smart decision, even though it cataclysmically led to World War II. But I think you're right that idea that, we're going to take Greenland, we're going to annex Canada, we're going to we're going to take Panama. It frightens me that we live in an era where people are largely ahistorical.
Yep.
And where they do not know any of these lessons, and where they haven't seen any of the problems that occur. I was around for the first invasion of Panama, the 1989 invasion of Panama, when I was at the Defense Department. It was pretty easy work. They did not have close trade relationships with China at that point. They did not have close trade relationships with the rest of the world at that point. Even that wasn't an easy, no risk operation. And that was just to do one thing, take one guy, get him out. Yeah. Imagine trying to take over another tropical paradise.
Yeah, I mean,
it just blows my mind how no one calculates out, what if the canal is shut down for 3 weeks, 6 weeks, a month, a year?
Yeah, I mean,
there's so much badness.
I agree. And look, Rick, I'm glad you brought up the 1930s and the Nazis, because I think this is a really relevant and pertinent comparison. Like, what is the context of Hitler's expansionism in the 30s? Not just the Sudetenland, but the whole vision of Lebensraum and trying to conquer modern day Ukraine and parts of the Russian, it was then the Soviet Union. The idea was this came out of the breakdown of the global economy after the Great Depression. The Hawley-Smoot tariff that I think Trump probably is one of the few people in America who thinks that was a good thing.
Who hasn't internalized just what a disaster that was.
Yeah, like you have what you wind up having, the breakdown of the global economy. You had seen sanctions that had been imposed on Mussolini after the annexation of Abyssinia. And Hitler's calculus was, I need this territory for my economic growth and for the health, economic health of the German people. It's something that Adam Tooze in his books documents really well. I worry that thinking where the autarky leads in a very dangerous direction, whether or not it's next year or the year after. Like, if this is the direction of travel, not just of the US economy, but the world economy, which I think is the natural result of threatening sanctions and tariffs on everybody and basically not having any sort of long-term agreements with anybody, that's a future that I don't want to live in.
Yeah. And I think that because of the hyper-globalization, as you pointed out, and the super interconnected supply chain, the things that will be outcomes of that, I think they have underscored the risk factors across the board. We don't make generator turbines in America. Whether that's a good thing or not, it's a reality. What happens if we cede Pacific leadership completely to the Chinese and they take out Taiwan? It will be a global tragedy, but it will be a thing that Americans have not processed yet, because one of the things that crashed our economy in 2020 during COVID was TMSC got behind on chip production.
Yep.
And folks, TMSC is a enormous fab the size of Belgium, basically, where they produce the vast majority of semiconductor chips that come into our markets.
That's right.
China takes Taiwan, takes TMSC. They have an economic gun to our head indefinitely. We do not have that capacity. And again, we're not arguing it's a good thing or a bad thing. We just don't anymore.
Yeah, I agree. And I think oftentimes we overestimate how bad deterrence is, right? And underestimate the consequences if we don't get deterrence, right? Like in this case, Trump has made a lot of comments that I think potentially even could encourage or embolden Xi Jinping to potentially take action against Taiwan, where he's like, if Taiwan doesn't invest in the US, we're not going to protect them and all these kinds of things. He says the same thing about NATO allies. But what are the costs going to be if they actually go forward with that? What are the costs if China, quarantines Taiwan? The best estimate is it's a 10% hit to the global economy, right? I mean, think about that. I mean, just like we're talking about the worst recession we faced in the US in any of our lifetimes, So the thing I worry about is Trump oftentimes talks about how unpredictability is a good thing and keeps everyone on their toes. But when you're unpredictable, when you don't lay down clear red lines and people think you're mercurial, the risk is that folks actually underestimate your willingness to act. And that's usually actually what winds up happening. It's pretty rare that, a dictator like Xi or Putin says, oh, well, the US is going to be tougher than they are. And so,
Right.
So that's something that I worry about.
Yeah. And the whole principle of nuclear deterrence that worked very well for, and still has, knock wood, was that there were extraordinarily rational procedural frameworks that both sides understood very, very, very clearly, and that there were things to prevent irrational actors at any point in the process from taking complete control and putting us all at existential risk. Economically, I think you're right that the desire to have rational, predictable partners is not a bad thing. That doesn't lead to less economic growth. It leads to more. Rules-based systems lead to more economic prosperity rather than less. So when you're looking at that equation right now, and we have a very irrational actor at the top of the American government with a very tight grip on it, what are other countries in your mind going to do as Trump starts to do things that are so wildly out of the pocket of normal American political behavior that they feel a need to actually respond in kind or at least in a deterrent fashion.
Yeah. No, look, I think we're already seeing the beginnings of this, right? Mm-hmm. And the first kind of phenomenon you're seeing is hedging, right? And this is what allies are doing. So if you're an ally, if you're Canada, if you're Mexico, if you're the Europeans, and you don't think that you can guarantee that tomorrow you're not going to get hit by 25% tariffs or sanctions by the United States, it's pretty hard then for you to say, oh, well, I'm also going to work with the United States to isolate China. Like, you can't really, I mean, you can't do both of those things at the same time. And I've already seen worrying signs that the Europeans, who I think Biden had spent a lot of his presidency really trying to wrangle into an anti-China coalition. Mm-hmm. You now see Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, saying like, we may have to reevaluate our stance on China. Because you can't, both isolate yourself from China and the US if you're the Europeans. So I think we're already seeing hedging. I think some of these projects that the Chinese and the Russians have built to establish workarounds to the US financial system and the US dollar, like China's central bank digital currency, the digital renminbi, or they built these alternatives to the SWIFT network, which is the financial messaging network that is used to move money around the world. So far, those have really blossomed in places like China and Russia. But I think what you're going to see is you're going to start seeing European banks and Japanese banks and banks in India and other countries that find it appealing to join some of these initiatives, because they're not going to also want to be dependent on the dollar if they feel that they could just get cut off by Trump any day. And by the way, this happened during the first Trump administration. So we have evidence of this, right? Where when Trump unilaterally pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal and reestablished sanctions on Iran, the British, the French, and the Germans actually built a platform explicitly to evade US sanctions. I mean, it's something you think that like Iran does or Russia does. You don't think about our three closest allies doing that. But that's what happened during the first Trump administration. And they weren't particularly successful, I think, because they were cobbling it together. And then eventually they're bailed out by Biden. But I think now, you have some pretty advanced platforms that the Chinese and Russians have built. And it's not so hard to imagine the Europeans and Japanese and others wanting to join these systems, if only just to have an alternative to the dollar in case Trump decides to turn the economic cannon on them.
Well, and I think that there are rational worries on their part that in an ordinary climate there would be an escalatory period. There would be warning shots fired politically and diplomatically and whatnot before it went to crazy levels. So Trump, overnight saying 25% for Canada, 25% for Mexico, changing his mind the minute they call him up and kiss his feet a little bit. I think that idea that you have to build an alternative system just as insurance against this guy is something that is probably going to be very appealing to a lot of these countries, because the growth of China is continues. There are only true peer competitor economically, and they seem to be working around this problem by building diplomatic and economic relationships in Africa and Latin America and South America, throughout Asia, that not only without Trump were we not playing catch up on it, but now with Trump, we will never catch up on those things.
Yeah, it's pretty hard. And I think, look, this is just the initial, the initial concerns I have about hedging, right? And we didn't even get to I think something that's potentially more immediately problematic, which is retaliation.
Say more about that. Say more about that.
Because look, during Trump's first term, when he launched this trade war against China, the Chinese were basically wholly unprepared. Right. They didn't think this was going to happen. And then when it did happen, Xi Jinping basically saw Trump as an easy mark, somebody who he could basically talk back from anything. And by the way, he was right. When Trump imposed export controls on ZTE, the Chinese telecom equipment maker, in April 2018, the company was about to shut down. We were literally about to shut down the second biggest Chinese telecom equipment company. And then Xi Jinping calls Trump and says, please give me a reprieve. And he did. He pulled back the sanctions. He basically did the same thing against Huawei a year later, although in a less public way, because you had people in the administration at the time, like Bob Lighthizer, like Matt Pottinger, who I think were doing everything they could to really prevent Trump from completely backtracking. But they created a lot of loopholes, right? And of course, then they get this phase one trade agreement that, Trump had been kind of chasing throughout the first term. But in the year since, China has built its own arsenal of economic weapons. And, Trump has this idea, Rick, that because we have a giant trade deficit with China, we could win any trade war because we just have more that we can impose tariffs on, right? We import more from them, so there's more that we can tariff than they can tariff. But what he doesn't take into account is that China can also respond asymmetrically. They don't have to just respond with tariffs. They can impose sanctions on our companies. They can refuse to export things that we need. And that's what they've already done. They responded to Trump's initial salvo with tariffs, not just with tariffs, but by launching an anti-monopoly investigation into Google and NVIDIA. They sanctioned a U.S. company called Illumina, which is a big DNA sequencer. They sanctioned Philip Van Heusen. So they're already sort of doing targeted retaliation. And we've seen that these things can be really damaging. Right before the 2024 election, this is something people missed because everyone was focused on the election. China imposed export controls on the biggest U.S. drone maker, a company called Skydio. They're a critical supplier to Ukraine. They provide Ukrainians with the drones they need to document war crimes for battlefield intelligence. And they cut Skydio off from Chinese-made batteries. And overnight, this company, the biggest drone company in Silicon Valley, had to ration batteries, told their customers they could only have one battery per drone, which definitely limits the utility of it in a battlefield scenario. And there's nothing we really could do about it. And this is just like one company getting sanctioned, right? So my concern is, Trump, in a fit of pique, decides to impose even more tariffs on China, doesn't think about the consequences, and we get hit back, not where we're expecting it, but in all kinds of other ways that wind up leading to a tit-for-tat escalatory spiral.
Yeah, I think that's very on point. I think China has one more gigantic asset that they've never had before, and that's that Elon Musk, the co-president, is deeply, deeply, deeply dependent on Chinese production at his Shanghai Tesla factory, deeply dependent on battery production, and looks at that market as his primary growth area in the future. And as EVs are being developed in China that are less expensive than Tesla, longer range than Tesla, I think he is doing everything he can to keep Xi and the Chinese leadership mollified, and he'll be in Trump's ear on the on it will conflict with Trump's base, but that won't matter to Elon. He's not there for the base. He's there for his own self-interest. And I think that is an asset China could not have planned better if they tried.
Yeah. Look, I think even in the first Trump administration, there were factions, right? And this is something that I think gets a little bit like smoothed over by history, this idea, oh, Trump is such a big China hawk. If you look back at the first administration, he really like vacillates between hawkishness and obsequiousness. One day he's super tough on China. The next day he's, calling Xi Jinping his best friend, and, they're sharing the best piece of chocolate cake they've ever had in their lives. So, and what happened during the first term is you had people like Lighthizer, like Pottinger, who were pretty tough on China. And whenever there was kind of an opening, whenever Trump was in the frame of mind to do something tough, they kind of pushed their policies forward. But then whenever Trump was in sort of the obsequious frame of mind, people like Steven Mnuchin, who was a Goldman Sachs guy, was like, oh, okay, let's actually keep, not do this thing that's tough on China. And I think that Mnuchin role is going to be played in kind of a supercharged way by Elon Musk in this administration, because you have the hawks, you have Marco Rubio, you've got Mike Waltz. If you look at their backgrounds, they've been super, super tough on China.
I know both men, and they are both China hawks. I mean, speaking of Huawei, Marco led the charge in the Senate on trying to make sure Huawei equipment was not embedded in too much of the U.S. telecom system.
Exactly.
Things like that. But
yeah.
We're focused deeply right now, I think, on the idea in Trump's head that American economic dominance is going to be based solely on this tariff fight. Where do you see this playing out in the next year as other nations start to show not only that they're not afraid of it? I mean, I don't think the Chinese have responded like Trump planned at all. They've been very meticulous, very calibrated. They've caused pain, but not trauma. if that makes sense. And they've caused pain that's going to ratchet in red states. They've caused pain that's going to bring political pressure internally inside Trump's own coalition. Where do you see the tariff thing playing out? Does it just sputter off and die, even though Trump promised it would be, it's the key to the golden age of America and all that? Or do you think that it leads to an actual point of conflict and calamity?
I don't think it's going to die. I think that right now markets are too sanguine about this. I think if you look at how markets are reacting to Trump, they're always so hopeful that, oh, well, he's not serious about tariffs. My own view is that there are very few things that are consistent in Donald Trump's head. And Rick, you probably have you said you're an expert on Trump. You may have a better view on this. But from what I can tell, at least on foreign policy, there are very few things that he's actually consistent on. And probably the thing he's most consistent on are that tariffs are a good thing. Mm-hmm. And he's been saying this for a very long time. So reflexively, he's always going to go back to tariffs.
By the way, the first quote on tariffs I've got from Donald Trump in my reading over the years was from 1983.
Yeah. So there you have it. Right. This isn't like a new thing for him. So I do think that the tariff and trade war will happen. I think it's already happening because, as you said, even though he has pulled back the initial threats on Canada and Mexico, it's not like the Canadians are like, oh, well, we're safe now. It's like, no, they're going to start exploring, like, how do we get our oil piped to port so we can export it to China instead of just being reliant on selling it all to the US? And I think that'll probably wind up being a big part of the upcoming Canadian election. Because once you feel, this is actually a big theme in my book, is, trust once lost in economic relations is really hard to regain, because once you feel this visceral sense of insecurity, like, it's not like, oh, the next day, oh, well, okay, great, we're going to be comfortable being 100% reliant on selling our oil to the United States, right? So I do think it'll happen. I think that it'll happen in a way that's very unpredictable, that doesn't follow a logical course. Right now, they're on this thing of reciprocal tariffs, but it could wind up changing, next week. And frankly, I think this podcast episode will come out sometime in February. But, by March 1st, if he doesn't like what is happening with Canada and Mexico, we could actually see those 25% tariffs go into effect. And my own view, based on my conversations I've had, is that Trump did actually plan to go forward with the tariffs on February 1st, but then kind of back down, during that last minute because he saw the market reaction and was very worried about, kind of spoiling the opening few weeks of his presidency with a big decline in the stock market.
Right. Well, and you've had Ken Griffith and Jamie Dimon and a lot of other folks that Trump mistakenly views as his economic peers, but who are very much more sophisticated thinkers about these, starting to show a little more leg in their concern about this. They're starting to show a little more panic about it. I mean, look, JP Morgan initially during the campaign was like, oh, the tariff stuff, it's just all rhetoric. It's just bait for his base. It's all political rhetoric. Then it was like, well, we don't think it's really, really just rhetoric, but it might sort of be a presentational thing. And then it was like, well, he'll do tariffs, but they won't last long. Then it was, the tariffs won't do too much damage. Now it's like, oh shit.
Right. Oh yeah. And look, at some point, someone is going to call your bluff. Like, I think this is the other thing though, is like, let's say like the worst, and I don't think this is what we're going to have, but I think the best case scenario is one where we see more of what we saw in the first couple of weeks of the administration. He doesn't like something that happens. He puts out an angry post online on True Social saying, we're going to tariff and sanction you. And then he has an off ramp. Right. But I think even if that's the trend, you still get this hedging behavior that I mentioned before. And also problematically, you run the risk of miscalculation, right? I mean, you're then assuming that everybody's just going to sit still and say, okay, well, hopefully this will blow over. But, sometimes adversaries want to kind of punch you in the mouth to try to send a message and to reestablish deterrence. And I would agree with your assessment, Rick, that China's initial response to the 10% tariffs were kind of more like a shot across the bow. But what they did was, by not just saying, okay, we're going to do exactly the same thing, here are 10% tariffs on you, the United States, but by doing these targeted retaliations against Google, against PVH, banning tungsten exports to the U.S. and other critical mineral exports to the U.S., they're showing that this is not going to be limited to a tariff war, because Trump feels like he can win a tariff war. But I think he probably feels a little bit less comfortable if it's a multi-front economic war with China. That's not to say we wouldn't win, but I think we'd probably both wind up being worse off if that were the likelihood.
Right. Right. Well, Ed, I want to thank you for coming on the show today. This was a fascinating discussion, folks. The book is ChokePoints: American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. Edward Fishman. He is a brilliant thinker about this, and I hope we can talk again, because I feel like this is going to be a through line in the next 4 years of that defines this administration in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I agree, Rick. Thanks for having me on, and always happy to return.
Absolutely. Thanks again. The enemies list today is absolutely crystalline clear. It is simple. It is crisp. It is Donald Trump, Pete Hegseth, and J.D. Vance. They are in Europe right now at the Munich Security Conference, where the NATO nations come together and they decide on policy in the coming year. There's one question at hand. Only one. It's Ukraine. That's it. It's the whole deal. It's the whole thing. Trump called Putin, sold out Ukraine. Vance gets over to Europe and speaks of Ukraine in a dismissive and insulting way. Then he has to backtrack because he's a chicken shit. Pete Hegseth, that sloppy, drunk fucking frat boy who thinks negotiating with our NATO allies is like a Sunday morning or a Saturday morning on Fox News, where you can get liquored up and swing your dick around. He also went in, if you're negotiating with Vladimir Putin, you don't go in and say, oh, Ukraine can't go back to its 2014 borders. Ukraine can't join NATO. It's bad enough that you've betrayed them. It's bad enough that you sold out to Vladimir Putin. It's bad enough that you are making Neville Chamberlain look like Genghis fucking Khan. But then to take your vaunted negotiations and embarrass America in the way that the three of these men have done this week, and to diminish and kill off American power as they've done this week, is unthinkable. It's insane. It's irrational. Actually, it's very rational. Trump has wanted to capitulate to Putin from the very beginning. He hates Ukraine. He doesn't really like America. He's envious of Vladimir Putin's ability to kill and silence his political opponents. And so he'll do anything to get Daddy Vladdy's approval. Gentlemen, and I use that term incredibly loosely, you are all failing to maintain America's strength, America's honor, America's power in the world by ceding Ukraine to Vladimir Putin. You know what happened since this all went on? Vladimir Putin is now firing drones and missiles at fucking Chernobyl. Oh, yeah, he learned his lesson. What are you, Susan Collins? Get the fuck out of here. You guys are all on the enemies list, and thus you shall remain.